What if I told you that everything you think you know about Princess Diana's ancestry is only half the truth? The world remembers her as the shy young woman who became a global icon, a princess adored by millions. We point to the Spencers, the polished aristocratic family, wealthy, refined, untouchable. But that's just the official fairy tale. Behind the name Spencer hides a legacy far darker. A bloodline not of gowns and charity, but of betrayal, execution, and forbidden desire. A story soaked in blood and erased from polished history books, yet flowing through Diana's very veins. The name you need to remember is not Spencer, it's Tudor. Yes, that Tudor. The dynasty of Henry VIII, of broken vows, of beheaded queens. History insists the Tudor line ended centuries ago. But official history often tells the sweetest lies. Our story doesn't begin in the glittering halls of Buckingham Palace, nor in the elegant country estates of the Spencer family. To uncover the truth behind Diana's bloodline, we must go back, 5 centuries back, to a dynasty defined not by grace, but by blood and fire. It begins not with Diana herself, not even with the Spencers, but with a woman history tried to bury. Her name was Mary Tudor. Now, when most people hear that name, they think of Bloody Mary, the infamous Queen of England. But that is not the Mary we're speaking of. This was another Mary, the younger sister of King Henry VIII. She was celebrated as one of the most beautiful women in Europe, with hair like red gold flame and eyes that could disarm or destroy with a single glance. Henry adored her. He called her his pearl, but pearls, no matter how luminous, were never free. They were locked away, traded, used as bargaining chips. In 1514, when Mary was just 18, Henry forced her into a political marriage with King Louis II of France. Louis was no youthful prince. He was an aging, sickly man in his 50s, frail and weary, with a body weakened by disease and years of rule. Imagine being Mary, a girl full of fire and passion, suddenly trapped in the cold stone corridors of the French court, surrounded by strangers who watched her every move with suspicion. A guard at the palace once told his son that the only warmth in those frozen halls was the sound of Mary's laughter echoing through them. But that warmth didn't last long. Just 82 days after the wedding, Louis XVI was dead. Mary Tudor, barely out of her teens, had become a widow. And with widowhood came a kind of freedom, but a dangerous one. Because for a princess in the 16th century, freedom was always temporary, a pause before the next political bargain was struck. Mary knew her brother Henry would never allow her to choose her next husband freely. To him, she was not just his beloved sister, she was a pawn in the endless chess game of European alliances. But Mary had made a vow long before she ever set foot in France. Before her departure, she had fallen deeply in love with Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk. Brandon was not royal, but he was powerful. Henry's closest friend, a man trusted at court, a man whose star was rising. He held Mary's heart. And she had made him a promise. If she ever became a widow, she would choose him as her second husband. It was an oath written not in ink, but in fire. To follow it meant to defy her brother, the King of England himself. And defying Henry VIII was as good as signing your own death warrant. When Louis XVI died, Henry moved quickly. He dispatched Charles Brandon to France with explicit orders, escort my widowed sister home. But there was another unspoken command, sharp as any blade, do not touch her. Henry knew of their affection. He knew temptation lurked in every glance. As if to test Brandon's loyalty, he pressed into his hand a golden signet ring, a symbol of trust, of faith. Imagine Brandon crossing the channel, the sea spray striking his face, that heavy ring burning in his pocket like a curse. He was caught between 2 impossible choices: loyalty to the king who had given him everything, or love for the only woman who could give his life true meaning. When Brandon finally stood before Mary in her mourning chambers, draped in black velvet, their eyes met, and in that instant, grief gave way to something else. Recognition, desperation, a plea unspoken but burning. That night, Mary confronted him with a boldness that astonished everyone who knew her. Wrapped in silks, she looked at him not as a timid sister of a king, but as a woman on the brink of ruin. "Marry me," she demanded. Not a request, an ultimatum. Brandon hesitated. He warned her of Henry's wrath, of the Tower of London, of the executioner's axe that fell without hesitation. He reminded her of Edmond de la Pole, executed for nothing more than being a distant threat to Henry's throne. But Mary was unshaken. If he refused, she threatened, she would make sure Henry knew he had abandoned her. She would tell the king that Charles Brandon broke her heart. It was a trap with no escape. Betray Henry and die, or betray Mary and be destroyed by her words. Brandon made his choice. In a small chapel outside Paris, with only a few trembling servants as witnesses, they defied the most powerful man in Europe. Charles slid a borrowed ring onto Mary's finger, and in that moment their fate was sealed. As the priest whispered blessings, a gust of wind burst through the doors, extinguishing half the candles and plunging the chapel into shadows. The omen was unmistakable. Their union was not the beginning of peace. It was the start of a curse. The journey back to England should have been triumphant. A royal procession, the return of a beloved princess. Instead, it was a march of dread. Every creak of the ship's timbers sounded like the grind of an executioner's axe. Every wave crashing against the hull felt like Henry's fury bearing down on them. Brandon and Mary barely ate, barely slept. They wrote letter after desperate letter pleas to the king, offers of jewels, of dowries, of anything that might buy their survival. When they reached Dover, the welcome was colder than the Channel winds. No cheering crowds, no banners, only a handful of officials. One of them, a sharp-eyed courtier named Sir Giles, made his contempt obvious. He refused to address Mary as "Your Grace." Instead, he looked at Charles with pity, almost mockery. His silence carried a message louder than words. You are no longer the king's friend. You are a traitor. From Dover to London, their journey became a slow death march. At every inn, at every hall, they were confined to locked rooms. No freedoms, no honors, only the suffocating weight of disgrace. Servants who once bowed deeply now whispered in corners, refusing to meet their eyes. One night, a stable boy slipped a crude drawing beneath their door. It showed the Tower of London, two figures standing on a scaffold. The meaning was unmistakable. England expected their execution. By the time they entered the capital, the story of their secret marriage had spread like wildfire. The court buzzed with gossip. Nobles smirked behind their hands. And at the heart of it all stood Henry VIII, furious beyond words. This wasn't just disobedience. It wasn't just betrayal. It was humiliation, his sister and his closest companion making a fool of him before the eyes of Europe. And Henry was not a man who forgave humiliation. The first blow wasn't an executioner's axe, but isolation. Mary was placed in chambers filled with flowers, silver platters, and velvet cushions. Yet the doors were locked from the outside. A gilded cage is still a cage. Charles, meanwhile, was taken to a barren stone room with a single barred window, the walls closing in like a tomb. From that window he could see nothing but blank walls. Henry wanted fear to gnaw at them slowly, to rot their courage from the inside. For weeks there was silence, no verdict, no word of mercy, just the endless torment of waiting. And then, at last, came the summons, but only for Charles Brandon. He was led through Greenwich Palace, down corridors lined with tapestries depicting Henry's victories in war. Each woven image mocked him, reminding him of the king's might, the futility of defiance. At the end of the maze sat Henry VIII, not in a throne room filled with courtiers, but in a small, private study. And he was calm. That was the most terrifying part. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He simply sat polishing his fingernails with a dagger, as though Charles's life were nothing more than a passing thought. "Charles," Henry finally spoke, his voice smooth, almost gentle, "the man I raised from nothing. Did you truly believe I wouldn't discover this betrayal?" Brandon knelt, trembling, words choking in his throat. Henry leaned forward, dagger still in hand. "You know the law," he continued. "To marry the king's sister without consent, that is treason. And the punishment for treason is death. The headsman sharpens his blade every morning. Perhaps he wonders, who will it be today?" Henry let the silence stretch, tightening around Brandon like a noose. Then, with a cold smile, he shifted his tone. "But perhaps your head is worth less to me on a spike than your life is in my debt." Brandon felt a flicker of hope, but Henry's mercy was its own kind of cruelty. The punishment he laid out was devastating. First, Mary and Charles would repay every coin of her French dowry, every jewel, every estate stripped away. They would live noble in name, beggars in truth. Second, humiliation. They would be forced to remarry publicly, this time under Henry's watchful eye, kneeling before him to beg forgiveness. Their love would not be remembered as defiance, but paraded as submission. And finally, the most brutal blow, their children. Henry declared that any children of Mary and Charles would live only because he allowed it. They would hold no claim, no title, no power. They would be monitored, controlled, their very lives chained to the crown. Charles left that chamber not as a condemned man, but as a broken one. He had walked in fearing death. He walked out condemned to something worse, a lifetime of servitude to the king who despised him most. And so Mary and Charles were spared, but only to suffer. Their marriage, born of passion and defiance, was turned into a curse that would echo through generations, weaving itself into the Tudor bloodline, a bloodline that centuries later would flow in the veins of Princess Diana herself. On the surface, Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon's lives appeared to recover. They lived in fine houses, wore rich clothes, hosted feasts. They had children together, 2 daughters who survived into adulthood, Frances and Eleanor. To outsiders, it may have looked like a noble family restored, but appearances deceived. Every decision they made, every guest at their table, every letter sent was shadowed by the king. Henry VIII had not truly forgiven them. He never forgot betrayal, and his revenge extended beyond Mary and Charles. It reached their children. Their eldest daughter, Frances Brandon, inherited her mother's fire. Strong-willed, proud, unafraid. Yet even she was trapped in Henry's web. Her marriage was not her choice. It was arranged by the crown, a calculated move to keep the dangerous Tudor bloodline under control. Frances was bound to Henry Grey, Marquis of Dorset, respectable but uninspiring. Not love. It was a cage disguised as security. For Mary and Charles, this was agony. They had risked everything for love, only to see their daughter denied the very freedom they had fought for. Henry's revenge was cruel. It did not end with them. It poisoned their children's futures as well. Frances and Henry Grey had 3 daughters. Their names would one day echo through history: Jane, Catherine, and Mary. 3 girls whose veins carried not only noble blood, but the dangerous inheritance of the Tudors. Of them, the brightest was Jane. Jane Grey was a scholar from her earliest years, studious, bookish, more at home with Latin manuscripts and Greek philosophers than with jewels or gowns. Those who knew her said her mind was sharper than any blade, her faith unshakable. Yet it was precisely these qualities that made her a pawn in a much larger game. By the time Jane was 16, the throne of England stood on shaky ground. Henry VIII was dead. His only son, Edward VI, frail and sickly, had inherited the crown. Behind Edward stood a cabal of Protestant lords desperate to keep power from slipping into Catholic hands. Henry's eldest daughter, Mary Tudor, known to history as Bloody Mary, was next in line. For the Protestant elite, this was unthinkable. And so they turned to Jane Grey, the granddaughter of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon. She carried Tudor blood, but she was Protestant. To them, she was the perfect solution, an alternative queen who could block Mary's claim. But Jane wanted no part of it. She longed for books, not crowns. She wept, begged, pleaded not to be forced into the deadly Game of Thrones. No one listened. The weight of ambition crushed her, and in July 1553, she was proclaimed Queen of England. For 9 days, the crown sat heavy on her head. Courtiers bowed, but their smiles were thin, false. In her heart, Jane knew she was alone. Her lady-in-waiting later recalled that the only time Jane smiled was when she received letters from her old tutor. Only in those moments did she feel like herself again, just a girl, not a queen. But history does not spare innocence. The kingdom rallied to Mary Tudor, Henry's eldest daughter. Jane's reign collapsed almost before it began. The Duke of Northumberland was executed. Jane, her young husband, and her father were arrested. What followed was a betrayal more cruel than any executioner's axe. Jane's own mother, Frances, abandoned her. In a desperate bid to save herself, she begged Queen Mary for mercy, sacrificing her daughter's life for her own survival. Jane was left utterly alone. In February 1554, the end came. From her tower window, Jane watched her husband dragged to his death. She saw his headless body carted back past her chambers. Hours later, it was her turn. 17 years old, calm, dignified, she mounted the scaffold. Blindfolded, she reached for the block but could not find it. Panic broke through her composure. "What shall I do? Where is it?" she cried. A guard guided her hands to the cold wood. A moment later, the blade fell. The granddaughter of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon, the child of a forbidden love, was dead. Her blood stained the ground of the tower, and with it the curse of this hidden bloodline deepened. Henry VIII's revenge seemed complete. The dynasty born from Mary Tudor's defiance had produced a queen, but only for 9 fleeting days. And for that brief spark of power, Jane Grey paid with her life. But history did not end on that scaffold. The bloodline endured, through Jane's sisters, through her descendants, through centuries of silence. A bloodline that one day would resurface in the most unexpected place of all, within the veins of Diana, the so-called People's Princess. Time. The execution of Jane Grey should have closed the book on this cursed bloodline. 17 years old, a queen for only 9 days, and then a martyr to ambition. But bloodlines have a way of surviving where they are not wanted. And in this case, it was Jane's sisters, Catherine and Mary Grey, who carried the Tudor flame forward. Catherine Grey was everything Jane was not. Where Jane was quiet, studious, and pious, Catherine was vivacious, charming, and strikingly beautiful. But beauty and Tudor blood together were a dangerous combination. Under Queen Elizabeth I, Henry VIII's second daughter, that combination was lethal. Elizabeth, like her father, was obsessed with control. She refused to marry, refused to name an heir, and saw any potential rival as a living threat. And Catherine Grey, as the senior surviving descendant of Henry VII's younger daughter, was a rival whether she wanted to be or not. Catherine knew the danger. She had watched her sister Jane walk to the scaffold for a crown she never sought. She should have lived quietly, invisible in the shadows. But like her great-grandmother Mary Tudor, Catherine made the fatal choice to follow her heart. She fell deeply in love with Edward Seymour, a nobleman whose family name carried power but whose union with her was politically explosive. They married in secret, defying the Queen's will. For a short time, their happiness seemed secure. But happiness, for those with Tudor blood, never lasted. When Catherine's pregnancy could no longer be hidden, Elizabeth's wrath ignited. She declared Catherine's marriage invalid, her children illegitimate, and then she imprisoned her, not in one dungeon but in a series of castles, moving her from place to place, always separated from Edward, never allowed to see the man she loved again. Catherine wasted away in captivity, her health declining rapidly. By the time she died at 27, she was officially recorded as sickly. But in truth, she was broken, a victim not of disease but of Elizabeth's fear. Another Tudor woman silenced, her children marked by shame, her love story crushed under the crown. And then there was Mary Grey, the youngest sister. Unlike Catherine, she was not celebrated for beauty or wit. She was born with dwarfism, her body small and bent, mocked by courtiers who saw her as harmless. But what they did not account for was the strength of her spirit. Mary, too, carried the cursed fire of her bloodline, and like the others, she dared to marry for love. Her choice was no glittering nobleman, no powerful duke, but the Queen's own sergeant porter, a man tasked with guarding doors, not ruling kingdoms. To Elizabeth, this was an unforgivable insult. Mary was punished, not with execution, but with years of house arrest, locked away from her husband, her love reduced to fleeting stolen moments under guard. Again and again, the pattern repeated, women of this bloodline choosing love over duty and paying for it with humiliation, imprisonment, or death. The message from the crown was unmistakable. This family would never be allowed to thrive. The Tudors might have ruled England with fire and iron, but their descendants through Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon were to be broken, diluted, forgotten. And, for a time, it worked. Catherine's children were declared illegitimate, stripped of all claims. Mary's line faded into obscurity. Their descendants became minor gentry, country squires, clergymen's wives. The proud Tudor name dissolved into the folds of ordinary English society. But history is rarely so neat. Blood has a way of finding paths even when it is hunted. For centuries, the descendants of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon slipped quietly through the cracks. They married into other families, changed names, hid in plain sight. The fire of the Tudor blood did not vanish. It simply went underground, waiting. And where did it reappear? In a family far removed from the throne. A family known not for crowns, but for sheep farming and careful business. Respectable, but unremarkable. The Spencers. For generations, the Spencers lived quietly, amassing wealth and land, never seen as royal. Yet deep within their family tree, forgotten by most, ran the same blood that had condemned Jane Grey, Catherine Grey, and Mary Grey. The same bloodline Henry VIII had cursed with humiliation and erasure. Centuries later, that blood would rise again in a woman whose name the world would never forget. A woman whose marriage was sold as a fairy tale, but whose lineage was anything but. Her name was Diana. For centuries, it seemed the crown's plan had worked. The line of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon had been humiliated, imprisoned, erased. Their children declared illegitimate, their names dissolved into the obscurity of parish records and dusty family trees. The blood that had once threatened the throne now ran quietly through country squires and modest landowners. The curse appeared to have succeeded, but bloodlines are stubborn things. They slip through cracks, they wait in silence, and when history least expects it, they return. That is exactly what happened with the Tudors. Through centuries of forgotten marriages, hidden connections, and unremarkable names, their bloodline flowed steadily forward until it resurfaced in the family of the Spencers. The Spencers were no royals. For generations they were landowners and sheep farmers, respectable, wealthy, yet hardly extraordinary. They built estates, married well, and cultivated an image of stability. But buried deep in their ancestry, like an inscription on an old locket, lived the blood of Mary Tudor, Charles Brandon, Jane Grey, Catherine Grey, and the cursed legacy of forbidden love. Fast forward to the 20th century. John Spencer, the 8th Earl Spencer, had a daughter. She was quiet, shy, luminous. She worked as a kindergarten assistant, far removed from the grandeur of palaces or the shadow of crowns. Her name was Diana Frances Spencer. That middle name, Frances, was not chosen at random. It was a family inheritance, passed down from her ancestor Frances Brandon, the daughter of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon. Few noticed, fewer cared. But it was there, a whisper from the past. When Diana married Prince Charles in 1981, the world called it a fairy tale, a commoner marrying into royalty. Millions watched the spectacle, convinced they were witnessing something entirely new. But the truth was far darker, far stranger. Diana was not a commoner at all. She was a daughter of the very bloodline the Tudors had tried to erase. A bloodline that had been forced into silence for centuries was stepping back into the spotlight, right at the heart of the British monarchy. Through Diana, the Tudor legacy returned. Through her veins flowed the same blood Henry VIII had once deemed too dangerous, the same blood that had seen Lady Jane Grey's head fall beneath the executioner's axe, the same blood that had condemned Catherine Grey to imprisonment and Mary Grey to obscurity. That blood, cursed and defiant, now pulsed in the heir to the throne, her son, Prince William. Think about the irony. The dynasty that Henry VIII tried to destroy, the line he punished with humiliation and ruin, lived on to become the very future of the monarchy he built. History, as it so often does, had come full circle. Perhaps this is why Diana captured the world's heart in a way no other royal ever had. She was not simply the people's princess. She was something older, something deeper, an echo of centuries of defiance, tragedy, and forbidden love. Every gesture, every act of rebellion against royal protocol, every tear shed under the weight of duty carried the shadow of her ancestors. When people looked into Diana's eyes, they saw grace and compassion. But beneath that, unknowingly, they were seeing the ghost of Mary Tudor, the courage of Charles Brandon, the innocence of Jane Grey, the defiance of Catherine, and the quiet resilience of Mary Grey. They were seeing the bloody Tudor legacy resurrected in modern form, And now, that legacy continues. Prince William, heir to the British throne, carries that same blood. The blood Henry VIII once fought to erase will one day sit upon the throne of England. The curse of the Tudors was never truly broken. It was simply waiting for its moment. History is rarely a straight line. More often, it is a circle, closing in on itself in ways no one can predict. What began in a secret chapel in France more than 500 years ago, when Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon defied a king, still shapes the monarchy today. So the next time you see an image of Diana, or watch her sons stand before the world, remember, this is not just a royal family. This is the revenge of a bloodline once buried, once silenced. The Tudors never died. They live on in Diana's smile, in William's future crown, in a legacy written not in fairy tales but in blood. And if you found this hidden story as haunting as it is fascinating, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who want to see the truth behind history's darkest secrets. Because this tale, like the Tudor bloodline itself, is not over, it is still unfolding,